occasion of having the renowned landscape architect Darrel Morrison with us tonight. We're just thrilled to be here and so happy to have so many of you turn out for this. My name is Laurel Hauser and I'm the Executive Director of Crossroads at Big Creek. And before we begin, I just wanted to take care of a few housekeeping items. I'd like to thank the bakers who have provided amazing desserts that will be available later after the presentation. Also like to thank John Welter of Novel Bay Bookstore, my favorite independent bookstore right in downtown Sturgeon Bay, who's here tonight with copies of Daryl's book. Following Daryl's presentation, we will have book signing, time for questions, book signing, and then help yourselves come and join us for some wine and coffee and desserts. Restrooms are down the hallway on the main floor, and there's an elevator here for use of anyone who would like that. And just a reminder to turn off your cell phones if you've got them on. I'd like to quickly just introduce my fellow staff members who are here, just so you know who we are here at Crossroads. I'm, as I said, Laurel Hauser. Kagan Heringa is here somewhere. There she is. And Nick Lutsky. Nick, do you want to stand up and wave? He's in the back. Nick is our land facilities manager. Kagan's our program director and naturalist. And Gretchen Schmelzer is a board member here. She greeted you when you came in. And so I wanted to point out our board members. Since Sturgeon Bay Education Foundation purchased 53.3 acres here in 1991 to create a school forest, all kinds of people who have loved Crossroads have been working to protect it and restore it. Crossroads has grown to nearly 200 acres now, and a little over a year ago, our board made a commitment to take that effort of restoration to a new level, and we hired Nancy Ayton and Dan Collins of Landscapes of Place to create an ecological restoration plan for us. We then submitted, with their help, and were successful in procuring just under $300,000 in state and federal restoration grants. And that has allowed us to, this year, plant 4,000 native trees and shrubs, all kinds of seeds and other plants. We and all of you who support us, are turning what was marketed at one point as the ideal place for a gas station into high quality, or at least medium on its way to being high quality land for the plants and the wildlife and the people who really appreciate and use Crossroads. We're really working to do some amazing things here. I kind of feel like stay with us. You haven't seen anything yet. But we'd like to thank all of you who support Crossroads, and we'd like to put in I'd like to put a little plug in for those of you who haven't been involved as much to be more involved. We have a Habitat Healers program on Saturday mornings where you can come and help plant. And you can be annual supporters of Crossroads, and we need and we welcome that support from the community, financial as well as volunteers. So we appreciate anyone who wants to become a member. We have membership cards on the table downstairs as you're leaving. Appreciate you considering that. I mentioned Nancy Ayton a bit ago, and she and her partner Dan Collins are truly responsible for us being here tonight and for having Darrel Morrison with us. And I'm going to have her come up and introduce Daryl. And I just think, for me, it's an honor to have someone I respect and admire so much be here to introduce someone she respects and admires so much and was a mentor of hers. So, Nancy.
Darrel Morrison is a storyteller in words, in essays, also in the public landscapes that he creates. Native landscapes that reintroduce diversity, natural processes, and naturally occurring patterns into the landscape. Some of you may know Daryl from classes he's taught at the Clearing in Ellison Bay. Thousands of others have been students of his at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, University of Georgia, Columbia University, and many other academic programs where he has been guest faculty. How many of you have taken a class of Daryl's? I know there are some. Daryl co-founded and co-edited the scholarly resource called Landscape Journal integral to the academic discipline of landscape architecture, now I think in its 5th decade. Daryl has led the field in blending ecology with art, and he has led the field by teaching in the field, giving his students quantitative and qualitative engagement in natural places that has changed our lives. I know Daryl as we sat on boulders sketching in watercolor in the meadows of the grassy bald, or assessing plant species quadrats on our knees in a savanna, or sitting in a deep forest in silence, paying attention, writing what we see and hear. I know him as my mentor. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to my very good friend, Darrel Morrison.
Thank you so much, Nancy, for the generous introduction. And yes, we've taught in the field together, and theoretically she was my teaching assistant, but really she was my co-teacher throughout that several years of field teaching in Georgia and other places. Well, we're here to talk a little bit tonight about beauty of the wild. And you might wonder where that title came from, and some of you may know where it came from. In 1913, Jensen, whose name is familiar to most of you, I'm sure, commissioned a playwright, Kenneth Sawyer Goodman, to write a masque, M-A-S-Q-U-E, or a conservation play that was performed at various sites that Jensen and others thought should be protected and preserved, and oftentimes with good results. And I was mulling over the title of the book for quite a while, actually, thinking ecology and art and ecology, various things. And then it dawned on me, we already had a great title with the Masque by Robert Goodman. And in fact, we checked, and it's okay to use the title again because it's in the public domain since 1926. So we're all clear. But I really liked the sound of it, because so often I think a lot of people, not this crowd, but a lot of people think that beauty in a garden cannot be wild. It has to be cultivated and trimmed and all those good things. But the really beautiful landscapes are wild landscapes. And one of my reasons for being such a strong advocate of field teaching, as I've done for 60-some years now probably, is that you can't get it all out of a book. You can't get it all from pictures. You've got to be in the landscape. And it really does trouble me that so many landscape architecture students spend so many hundreds of hours in front of a computer and so very few hours in the landscape, and especially the naturally evolving landscape that can really inspire and instruct us a lot. So anyway, that's where the title of the book came from. And if I can get my... Let's see. Is there something I haven't done? I want to push that.
Is it just this one? Yeah.
Oh, it's that one.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I'm a technophobe, a biophile and a technophobe. But anyway, here as you gaze at a portion of the native plant garden at the University of Wisconsin Arboretum, I'll just say a little bit more about the book and the intent of the book. The book is, for all practical purposes, a memoir. And I once heard Jill Kerr Conway, a writer who wrote memoirs, saying, memoirs are a special type of fiction. So, and then another person who talked about memoirs was Laura Ingalls Wilder, whose books, Little House in the Prairie, Little House in the Big Woods, and all those in which she wrote about growing up. And she said, I always told the truth in my books. Well, maybe not the whole truth. So I probably have exercised a little bit of selective memory in writing this, but I really did try to tell the truth throughout. Anyway, what the book is basically is about the influences on me, both people and places that have influenced me and led me to do the kind of work I do, which you see on the screen. Maybe 5-10 years before this picture was taken, this was a lawn, outside the visitor center at the University of Wisconsin Arboretum. And look what you can do with what used to be a lawn. And you've been experiencing that around your building here, I'm sure, and many of you in your own pieces of land. So anyway, it's a story about people and places. And in the process, I'll try to tell you some things that I have learned along the way. And it's been a wonderful, long trip, and I've enjoyed it a lot. So anyway, it'll be kind of a blend of memoir and a little bit of teaching and just experiencing landscapes. Okay. Well, first, in terms of place, I grew up in southwest Iowa in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and the photograph on the screen is actually a prairie preserve in Iowa, representing what the land probably looked like where I grew up 200 years before I grew up there. For over 10,000 years, there was prairie and oak savanna covering most of Iowa. So that's the basic landscape that I was born in, but it did change a lot by the time I was there, starting in 1937. But there are a lot of characteristics about the prairie that are so wonderful. And people go to the mountains, they go to the oceans, but the prairie is equally spectacular, in my opinion. And one thing that is so important is the sky in the prairie, in that it influences everything. There are the summer thunderstorm skies, there are the winter blizzard skies. It's always changing and always affecting the way we feel. So there's the sky, there's the horizontality of the prairie, typically, flatland. And flatland can be very dramatic, actually, in its way, kind of like the ocean. In fact, early arrivals in the prairie country talked about it as being waves of grass or ocean-like expanse. And you kind of get that in this rare restored prairie in Iowa. It's also filled with beautiful vegetation, probably 60, 70 species per acre on the average, and more in some places. But there's the basic fabric of grasses, 5 to 10 grass species that make up probably 90% of the prairie vegetation. The remainder are flowers like the oxeye you see here, sprinkled through the grasses. And it's not so evident here, but I'll point out other points where there is often what I call drifting of vegetation within the prairie, as if the seed had been distributed by the wind, which it might have been, and you see this directional flow of a certain color or texture within the prairie. And it is diverse, as I said, with 60 to 70 species typically occupying a single acre. And it was pretty well intact until 1837, a monumental year. That was the year that John Deere invented the steel bottom plow. Before that, it was nearly impossible to break the prairie sod. The prairie grasses would have roots down to 8, 10, 12, 15 feet. Big bluestem might have 15-foot deep roots, and it's very hard to break that with a wood bottom plow. But John Deere, for better or worse, invented the steel bottom plow in 1837. And within 2 to 3 decades, most of the prairie species in my home state of Iowa were gone on the land. It's estimated that 99.9% of Iowa prairies were plowed under during about a 2 to 3 decade period from 1830 to 1850. So it didn't survive in any quantity, unfortunately. Now we'll move on a little bit, I hope. Wrong. I have trouble with machines.
No, leave this like this, and it's
Oh,
this
yeah.
one, the right angle one. Yeah.
There we go. Thank you, Nancy. I always need Nancy's assistance. Well, and speaking of people who influenced me, these are the people who first had the major influence on me. I'm the one-year-old baby in my dad's arms here, and certainly they had a major impact on me. They were farmers, and I planted gardens from the time I was 6 years old here I am planting green beans, I think, in the rich black prairie soil in Iowa. And I was close to the land from the beginning, as you can see, very close. And we knew where our food came from. We knew that we were totally dependent on the sun and the rain and the soil. And we were also dependent on the plants and the pollinators of the plants for our farm and for our own food source, actually. And it's good to have that in your mind, that we are so dependent on those factors. Moving out of the garden, back to the prairie after much of it had been plowed. And again, as I was growing up in the 1930s, 40s, almost all of the natural prairie had been plowed under and replaced with single species crops like the soybeans you see here. But even here, when I was a kid, I experienced certain elements of the prairie. I felt the wind in my face and there was almost always a wind of some degree in the Iowa prairie. And also I had the big sky, again, cobalt blue sky before a thunderstorm in the summer, or the gray sky before a blizzard in the winter, and the ever-changing clouds, and then watching the shadows of those clouds roll over the prairie or the former prairie was something I always got a big kick out of. So anyway, the prairie had a big influence on me, just as my own parents had a big influence on me. Well, we'll jump. We're moving rapidly now. I spent those childhood years on the farm in Iowa. Then I went to Iowa State to get a degree in landscape architecture in 1959. And shortly after that, I was drafted into the Army. My first station that I was assigned to was Fort Hood, Texas. And I saw a new landscape there. I had really only seen the Iowa landscape for all practical purposes at the time I was drafted into the Army. And Fort Hood in general is really dreary. Lawns and poorly doing shrubs, clipped ligustrums and that sort of thing. Totally no character in the designed landscape at Fort Hood, Texas. But when we went out on our bivouacs to practice war games, we were in places like you see right here. And I remember being so impressed by how beautiful that landscape was, with such sparse resources, shallow soil, rocky soil, a lot of heat, a lot of drought, but yet there were plants adapted to that, and very beautiful compositions resulting from that. It's so dry there. In fact, I have to take a little water. Thank you. That's better. So anyway, I was at Fort Hood for basic training, a lot of fun, and then moved on to Fort Belvoir, Virginia, right outside Washington, D.C. And after that, I moved on to, I quote, graduated from the Army. I put in my 2 years as a draftee. And my first job was in Silver Spring, Maryland, working for the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. And the reason that that is important to me at this point is that I'm really messing it up. There we go. Was that in working at the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, okay, I do need help. Anyway, my boss at the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission was a guy named Joe Kondis, K-O-N-D-I-S, who's no longer living. But anyway, Joe had been a student of John Bracken, landscape architect at Penn State for decades. And he very early on, he practiced an ecological approach to design. He was kind of a voice in the wilderness much of the time. But anyway, John Bracken recommended a book to Joe Kondis, my boss, and Joe Kondis, my boss, loaned me his book, which was American Plants for American Gardens, authored by Edith Roberts, an ecologist, and Elsa Raymond, a landscape architect. And they wrote this beautiful book, American Plants for American Gardens, where they describe different plant communities of the northeastern United States based on field studies in Dutchess County, New York. And they wrote beautiful prose, but they also had a lot of information on species composition and the habitat, the environmental character of different plant communities. And one of my favorites is their description of the gray birch groves, early successional forests, just as you have paper birch here is one of the early successional forest types. And their description was beautiful. And I liked the fact that there was a scientist and an artist collaborating in that book. And it made me think, with my degree in landscape architecture, that I needed a whole lot more science in my background to inform and inspire the work I did. And so that led me to look at grad schools, various ones. I looked at some in Michigan, and then I arrived in Madison, Wisconsin, and that was really the place to be if I wanted to learn ecology and how it might relate to landscape design. And so when I was there, thank you, Nancy, I became acquainted with 2 restored prairies at the University of Wisconsin Arboretum. The one you see here is Green Prairie, named after Henry Green, a botanist. Beautiful composition that was planted in the 1930s, mostly with started plants. And then also there's the other major prairie there. The next slide is Curtis Prairie in the background. Foreground is the native plants garden, but in the background is the 40-acre Curtis Prairie, the first prairie restoration in the world, and now a designated landmark site because of that. And in seeing these prairie restorations, because basically the prairie itself that I had grown up with in Iowa was all gone by the time I got there. So I really saw these restored prairies as my first introduction to the grasslands and the beauty of them and the waving grasses and all the characteristics that are so typical of prairies. And while I was there, after grad school, I stayed on and taught for a while, 9 years. I was one of my students. He survived. And first I started a course in native plant communities of Wisconsin, again drawing on the work of Robertson Raymond and their American Plants for American Gardens, which is very much oriented to plant communities, i.e. plants that grow together in a similar environment at the same time. And so I thought landscape architects needed that background because it certainly helped me when I began to pick it up. So first I started a lecture lab course on native plant communities of Wisconsin, and then we had a great happening. The university started to offer a 3-week intersession in late spring, which was perfectly set up to be a field course. So I started a field course out of University of Wisconsin-Madison and taught that solo for a couple of years. And then I was joined by an ecologist, Dr. Evelyn Howell, and the 2 of us taught field courses for the next 8 years at the University of Wisconsin. And again, I can't say too much for the value of collaborating between an ecologist, a scientist, and a designer artist. And we would do quantitative studies in the field. As Nancy mentioned, we'd do quadrats, looking at a square meter, identifying everything in the square meter, sometimes mapping the location of the plants in the square meter. And in a prairie, there typically might be 6 to 9 prairie species, for example. Very diverse compared with the very limited plant diversity that we often do in planted landscapes. So that was great. But in addition to doing the quadrats and doing transects to determine percent cover of various species, we did sketches, we did watercolors as we moved on, especially after a little later when Nancy was involved. We were doing watercolor interpretations of what we were seeing. And I can't say enough for that exercise either, because when you look closely enough at a landscape to capture its character, you remember that landscape and you know what's important in it in terms of the species composition and the characteristic lines, forms, colors, textures. So the combination of art and science in the field, again, is a great thing to happen and needs to be happening more in a lot of landscape architecture programs, I might add parenthetically. I'm not doing it anymore. And in the field classes, for example, we would look at species composition, as in this wet prairie at Avoca Prairie, which is 50 miles west of Madison. and we'd see the different species in the different zones of moisture, which this is a very wet area here, but there's clear patterning. And then in another example, here we're in Marinette, not too far from here, during the northern Wisconsin week of the field course. And this brings to mind many things. Not only is it a great place to see northern vegetation and so beautiful, but it also brought to mind an essay by the landscape architect A.E. Bai, who wrote for Landscape Architecture magazine an essay in 1967, the year before I came to Wisconsin. Anyway, he wrote a wonderful essay called Landscape Luminosity. And this is something that I really value, and it's certainly good for landscape architects, but for anybody, namely taking advantage of the fact that the translucent leaves of a plant like the cinnamon fern, when backlit, glow. They're illuminated, and a designer can choreograph a landscape to take advantage of that, such that if you're at the breakfast table in the morning looking east, you can look through the cinnamon ferns or equivalent. Grasses also are great at becoming luminous with backlighting. So there's that. Not only species composition, but aesthetic effects that occur with different types of lighting. Okay, and then this led me to want to learn more about the work of Jensen, the person who had the conservation play written by Goodman. And many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the place I'm showing you here. This is the school, the clearing that Jensen established in 1935 when he was about 75 years old. He had worked in Chicago parks and then doing a lot of private landscapes for big personages in the world, like the Sears Roebuck family and many others, the Ford family, etc. But in 1934, his wife, Anna Marie, died, and he wanted to get out of Chicago, and he moved to the clearing, where he'd had a summer place since about 1919, 125-acre site right on the shore of Green Bay, on top of the Niagara Escarpment with this white stone bluffs. And he started this school for landscape architects and others. And he used to say that people came there not to learn to make a living, but to learn to live a life. And that was effective, I think. And we will now move on to a characteristic scene at the clearing. This is a view out the living room window of the main lodge at 3 white pines that have been there as long as I've been there, as long as I have visited there. Again, my first visit there was in 1970. I was teaching my first year at the University of Wisconsin. I brought a class up to the clearing, and we had a wonderful evening reminiscing with various people that Jensen had known, including his secretary, Martha Fulkerson, who came to the clearing when he came in 1935, and then she kept the school running after he died in 1951. And I do have to tell you the Martha story. That evening, I heard this straight from her, there was a little conflict between Jens Jensen and Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright thought he should be named the national architect, and he would have to pass on the design of any federal buildings built for the State Department anywhere in the world. Jensen was not enthralled with the idea that Wright would have that much power to pass judgment on all those designs. Jensen, I would say, did have a certain amount of respect for Wright and his professional work, some of it at least. But anyway, Wright wrote to Jensen and asked if he would write a letter of recommendation for his becoming the federal architect. Jensen ignored the first letter. Wright wrote a second letter. Would you please write me a letter recommending me to be the federal architect? Jensen ignored that letter. Well, Wright didn't give up easily. He wrote a third letter, said, would you please do this? And Jensen wrote back, and Mirtha Fulkerson typed the letter, which was a three-word letter, yeah, go to hell. And I heard that straight from Mirtha, so I believe it. But anyway, this is the classic scene at the clearing, I think. It is obviously generally a natural landscape, but equally obviously it has been managed to keep that vista open. And in the 30 years I was teaching at the clearing from 1973 to 2003, every other summer, and subsequently I and Nancy has certainly been involved in this too. We do selective removal to keep the vista open, but yet not look like it, without putting in a lawn and that character of landscape. So it is possible to manage and still keep a wild look. And here's another portion of the clearing. This is the inner meadow, not frequently visited by a lot of people, but it's, in my view, one of my favorite places at the whole clearing. This is an old pasture, had probably had some orchard in one part of it, and this is how it has evolved over a period of, well, probably 60 years. And again, this has required management to keep certain areas open, so you see a flow of space. And this is a good point for me to bring in the influence that a couple of environmental psychologists had on me. These are Steve and Rachel Kaplan, who taught at the University of Michigan for 50 years plus, and I got to know Rachel particularly well. But anyway, Steve and Rachel Kaplan identified 4 characteristics of naturally evolving landscapes that people seem to value, seem to like. One is mystery, not being able to see everything at one time. One is complexity, with a lot of species diversity, various colors, textures, forms, and even the complexity of the spaces. The third is coherence. There's complexity, but yet it's an ordered complexity. The old field junipers here unify it because they are repeated at various points, and the patterns of the coreopsis blooming also have a certain degree of coherence. And the last quality that the Kaplans identified after mystery, complexity, and coherence is legibility, being able to read how you will move through the landscape without being claustrophobic or feeling trapped at any point. And those characteristics I have found really useful in designing myself and in teaching students to design. And I often, in doing grading sheets for student projects, I would list those 4 characteristics and rate the student's design in terms of how well they met those qualities. So, and many of you know that Jensen had sort of a favorite form that he used in many landscapes, namely the council ring, a fire circle. And he talked about his love for that. It grew out of his growing up in Denmark with folk schools, but also he related it to the Native American population with the fire rings. And he talks about the circle being perfect because there is no head of the table. Everybody's equal, looking each other in the eye. And I like that quality as well. And also at the clearing, oh, we're beyond the clearing now. That's good, that's good. We've moved to Toft Point, a place many of you know, I'm sure. Land that was owned by the Toft family and protected for many years by Miss Emma Toft, who was also instrumental in protecting the ridges at Bailey's Harbor. But anyway, this is a watercolor I did, I see in 1997, one of the years I was teaching at the clearing. And this brings up the point of the importance of protecting natural areas. As I mentioned, Jensen had the play written to encourage people to protect outstanding natural areas. Toft Point has been protected. It's now a state natural area. And thanks to the efforts of Miss Emma and her family for protecting it all the years they were living, and now it's protected in perpetuity. But it's so important for so many reasons. One is the pure enjoyment that people can get from it, walking through it, but also for people like landscape designers to get the inspiration and have models for their own planting work that you don't ordinarily see. So both the intrinsic value of protecting those species and those landscapes, but also the instructional value of having them, the experiential value of having them is really important. And then at about the same time, little more water. I was plunging fairly headlong into doing some restoration work myself, and it was hadn't been practiced very much at corporate headquarters like the General Electric facility here at Pewaukee, Wisconsin. I had done a 2-acre prairie at an insurance company site in Madison, Wisconsin, and I jumped from that to this 80-acre prairie planting at General Electric. Kind of a deep dive there, but and here you see an area that was planted with a mix of native grasses and then hand broadcast with early successional forbs, the flowering plants. There's daisy fleabane, monarda fistula, bee balm, and black-eyed Susan, for example, which are great early successional plants, and they may be replaced later by later successional plants like lead plant that we incorporated into the seed mix. But anyway, I plunged in and was a great experience. And another great experience is shown in the next slide. This is our first burn at General Electric in 1981, 5 years into the project. And I will say the corporate executives were not wildly enthusiastic about our burning there, but I told them, well, you can have a fire truck here and we can mow fire breaks, and you can come help start the fires. So the executives were out there on a Saturday morning, and my students from Wisconsin were there, and we let the corporate executives drag burning brooms around the edge of the fire, and they loved it. And they became fans of prairie fires and prairies after that, I believe. Okay, now another big change, whole new paragraph here. In 1983, I was invited to go to the University of Georgia to become dean of the School of Environmental Design, and they made me an offer I couldn't refuse. I felt guilty in a way, leaving the prairie and leaving the landscapes of the Midwest, and I had no idea really what academic administration would be like. I found out. But to keep my sanity, I kept teaching field classes and classes in native plant communities at Georgia when I got there. And here you see one of my favorite landscape types there, probably because it has a lot of grasses in it, like the Midwest prairie. And this is at a place called the Big Woods near Thomasville, Georgia, with old growth longleaf pines, some of them up to 400 years old. As I say in the book, they were 200 years old when Beethoven wrote the Fifth Symphony, and they're still there. There's a lot of qualities about this landscape that are so attractive. One is there's a whole lot of species diversity. There may be 20, 30 or more species in 1 square meter. Can you imagine? It's hard to identify all of them. But another lesson here, I think, is that there are no big splashes of showy color, one single color mass planting. There's the intricacy of the patterns, the flecks of color within that predominantly grassy matrix. And I think that's a lesson to be learned also. It is so tempting when doing a prairie restoration or a meadow restoration to load it up with flowers and not have enough grasses, but you need that backdrop, partly for simply the support of the plants, also the wonderful root system that protects against erosion and sedimentation, but as much as anything, just the changing sequence of those flecks of color changing weekly as the season goes on. And I guess I mentioned I felt a little guilty about leaving the prairie behind, like it was somehow being unfaithful to the prairie. But I learned after a while that one can love both the prairies and the big woods and other landscapes. And another one I really loved was the the grassy balds. Again, grass enters into the picture. This is a black balsam gap along the Blue Ridge Park, the Great Smoky Mountain Parkway. Yeah, Blue Ridge Parkway. Yeah, Blue Ridge Parkway. And this is on a foggy day with a class in the field at Black Balsam Gap with Gray's lily, and then there are various grasses there, and a mix of forbs. Again, flecks of color within the overall backdrop of typically green things like hay-scented fern and other species. And another view of this is on a fall or winter day, and we were there, and Nancy was co-teaching a class with me there on a day when the wind was really blowing, and the wind will really blow in those locations. And I had my class sit down for half an hour, I guess, to do sketching or writing or whatever they wanted to. And I wrote my own little poem during that interim as well. And I'm taking the liberty of reading it to you now. It's not in the book, so you won't get it in the book. And I think I can even read it without my glasses. Okay. Blow, wind, blow. Blow waves of oat grass, hair grass, ripples of oat grass, hair grass. Blow, wind, blow, and take my breath away. Give me the wind and the sky and the clouds in grassy balds any day. Give me the panorama, prospect without refuge. Give me layers of blue mountains fading into the sky any day. Blow, wind, blow. Blow rippling waves of oat grass, hair grass, until they reach the dome-shaped horizon and touch the sky. The landscape is alive. I am alive. Blow, wind, blow. Take my breath away. I've never read that in public, so you're the first ones to hear. Okay, moving on. I'll check my time. Okay. Okay, another grassy environment in the southeast that I came to love were the salt marshes on the barrier islands and on the mainland on the east coast. Georgia has 1/3 of all the protected salt marshes on the whole east coast, so that's credit to Georgia for protecting them all those years. And even here there are lessons for design. The form of the water, the rivers of water with the masses of salt cordgrass, and I just love the compositions. Okay. And another landscape that I came to love a lot were the granite outcrops. There were at one point a very high concentration of granite outcrops in Georgia. Most of them became dump sites or were quarried, but there was a wonderful protected area, again, a protected site, Heggy's Rock, near Augusta, Georgia, and I would take classes there every year. Nancy has been in the classes that as a student and as a teacher. And here we see a little red plant, Diamorpha, oozing over the surface next to the shallow pools. Next slide will be, and this inspired me to do a design, to do a granite outcrop design. I was at that time working on a landscape plan for the Atlanta Museum of History in Atlanta, and I was laboring over what form to give this little 34-foot diameter circle in the front entrance court of the building. And actually I was on a flight one day from Prague to Atlanta, had a glass or two of wine, had my napkin in front of me, and started drawing, and this is what came out. The spiral there, and it really was inspired by what I had seen at Heggy's Rock. And the next slide shows the end result at the Atlanta Museum of History. The reason I'm showing this, or one reason I'm showing this, is to show that you can capture a little bit of the character of a really significant landscape in a small space. All the plants that are in this landscape are ones that grow in granite outcrops, including the oak, which is a Georgia oak endemic to granite outcrops. And it was rescued from a quarry where it was about to be destroyed by a couple of wonderful sculptors who worked with me on this. But anyway, we can work with native plants in a limited area, in an urban setting, and it looks okay, I think. Now I've got to give you the bad news. This was destroyed when they expanded the building a few years ago. But now the good news is they saved the parts, and it's being reconstructed at Trees Atlanta headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. It's a group that has been doing wonderful planting work in Atlanta for probably 30 years now. And they are going to reconstruct this in front of their new headquarters. I was on that site 2 weeks ago, in fact. So that's good. Onward. Okay, and while I was still in Georgia, I was also asked by Gregory. Gregory.
Armstrong?
I can't hear you.
Armstrong.
Greg Armstrong. How quickly I forget. Gregory Armstrong asked me invited me to do a design for a native plants garden at the University Arboretum, and in the lower. Can you show the original building, the horizontal one, and then a new wing was built?
Oh, the pointer's in the middle. Sorry.
There's the original building, and then the whole new wing was built. And then we had 4 acres around it to develop a native plant garden, and this was to represent a dozen different native plant communities of southern Wisconsin. And the Arboretum scientists had a list of species from each of those communities that they wanted me to incorporate into the design. Usually a landscape architect does the plan and then develops a plant list. I had a plant list and I developed a plan to match up with it. But just for example, maybe I need to do that. Yeah. This area here became predominantly mesic prairie, intermediate moisture. There's a little bit of wet mesic here at the lower part of the slope. This is definitely a slope leading up, and then a pathway that goes up the slope. Anyway, we have various moisture levels of prairie. There's a little amphitheater there looking out over Curtis Prairie, which is below the picture. We have the oak hickory forest represented here. We have maple basswood represented up there. We have a forest border of shrubs. We have a red cedar paper birch community represented here. And then we have a very long vista through here. There is actually some lawn there. And occasionally it's okay to have a little bit of lawn, but we certainly don't need as much as we usually have. Anyway, we'll move into the next. And keep that long vista in mind because I'm going to be showing you a picture of it that I want you to enjoy. This is in the, quote, wet mesic portion of the prairie. It's a fairly high moisture level. Hence, we see the prairie cordgrass predominating in the picture. Did people get the photo credits?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't want to have to recite all the photographers, so you have a list, I think, of credits for the photographs. But this one is taken by Susan Carpenter, who is the wonderful curator of the Native Plants Garden a few years after this planting was put in. Next slide. And here we're looking from the two-tiered amphitheater through an area in 2004, which was lawn at that time, and then Curtis Prairie is in the distance. In 2012 or 14, the next picture shows what it looked like after 8 years of growth. And it's pretty phenomenal how you can take what was a piece of lawn and have prairie moving in the breeze and all those things. Next slide. And here's the long vista from the circle at the left hand of the picture earlier all the way. Must be about the length of a football field or close to it. And here we have all the diversity of first a mesic prairie, then a wetland, then on the right in the trees are a bur oak savanna. We planted them as 2-inch trees in 2002, and this is what they looked like in 2020. And then we have a oak savanna, black oak savanna in the far distance. There's also a big tree in the left, which was a hybrid ash tree, which I wasn't wildly enthusiastic about, but it was there. And lo and behold, it got the ash borer last year and had to be removed. So we put in another area of prairie where that ash tree is gone. I shouldn't be happy about that, but I I do have to say something else here. Over the decades, over the centuries, I developed a philosophy that everything we design as landscape architects should have 4 qualities. One, it should be ecologically sound, meaning that the plants are matched with the site. We haven't introduced invasive species. We're not using toxic substances on its management. We're not wasting water and fuel to keep it short and uninteresting. So first, it should be ecologically sound, and part of that is having diversity equivalent to that which might be in a natural area. So ecologically sound and experientially rich, and I think there's not a lot of doubt that this landscape is experientially rich, and of course it's changing every week throughout the growing season, and actually is very beautiful in the winter as well. So experientially rich with movement and life, and then the fact that it is ecologically rich means there's other forms of life, butterflies, bumblebees, hummingbirds floating in and out, in and out. So ecologically sound, experientially rich of the place. We should know where we are when we're in a particular place. And so oftentimes the places we're in are so generic, planted with the same species anywhere, that are used anywhere in the country, making every place look like any place. Does that sound right? Okay. And finally, the landscape should be dynamic. It shouldn't be frozen in time. I like to think about various art forms. Paintings tend to be 2-dimensional. Sculpture and architecture is 3-dimensional. But landscape design is 4-dimensional, with time being the 4th dimension. And what you see in 2010 is not what you'll see in 2020 or 2030, if you live that long, and so forth. So those are four principles that I really shoot for, and people like my former students probably remember that. Okay, and here's that same scene in the fall with the dying ash tree. Next slide. And then a big leap. I had the very good fortune since 1996 of working with Storm King Art Center, a sculpture park about an hour and a half north of Manhattan in the Hudson River Valley. And here you see it probably about 3 years ago. We planted about 50 acres of tall grass plantings, which once were lawn. And in my humble opinion, now the whole landscape is sculptural, and then there are sculptures placed within that sculptural landscape. And it's really been exciting to watch, and they have been so supportive and patient, because it didn't look like this the year we planted it. And the planting has occurred over a number of years. And I'll be going there again probably in a couple weeks. Next slide. Here's a steep slope, which they had tried to mow historically. And it's not easy mowing on that slope, so it's just great to have Indian grass and switchgrass and big blue stem, little blue stem growing there. And you see large flat area in the lower left part of the picture. That is all native New York species of grasses, many of which are the same as we have in Wisconsin. Next slide. And here's planting early in its successional development with Canada wild rye playing a big part. I love that plant. It takes hold immediately, and then it gradually phases out as the little blue stem and side oats grama and Indian grass, other species take over. Okay. This is just a little interim watercolor sketch I did at Black Rock Forest, where I taught a field course on 3 occasions. Nancy was there helping me at least 2 of those times. But just a quick sketch to get the character of Black Rock Forest on a fall day. Moving on. Okay, that course, by the way, had been sponsored by New York Botanical Garden. And in about 2010, I was invited to do a plan for a steep slope next to the old stone mill, formerly the P. Lorelei snuff factory, built in the mid-19th century. And we had basically a steep slope, with the top of the slope being at the top of the plan, and 2 large sycamore trees, which you can find the sycamores, I think, Nancy, the 2 big trees.
That one and that one?
The red button.
That one?
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I didn't see it on my.
Oh, yeah.
It's not on my. Anyway, had 2 large sycamores and nothing else of any value. And here, I like to think that I was really invoking the rivers and drift theme, the idea that plants occur in drifts, and then the spaces among those, between them are the rivers. And here the kind of pinkish color that comes down through the center is a swath of little blue stem predominantly with other sun-loving plants. And then the 2 clusters of trees, one on each side, are gray birches, which are the early successional birches that Robertson Raymond loved so much in that early photograph. And then in the lower part, which sometimes is flooded, we have wet-tolerant plants, spice bush, winterberry holly, various streamside plants. And then you see the large drifts of different sets of species, which we don't have time to go into. But anyway, it was somewhat diverse. There's a stairway here which was not built, and I'm kind of glad because it gave us more planting room and more continuity of the planting. And a couple of pictures of this include this. This is a year after planting. You see the drifts of birches, you see the 2 big sycamores, you see the rivers of space, sometimes occupied by ferns, others by grasses, and onward. And here we're looking down over the site toward a beautiful bridge over the Bronx River. And we see the river birches in framing that view. And there's little blue stem at the top, which is very much native in New York. You might see little flecks of orange in there, which is some butterfly weed, which grows there naturally as well. And we planted the little blue stem and butterfly weed as plants, and some of the butterfly weeds were blooming a little bit as we planted them in June of 2011, 11. And within an hour and a half, the butterflies were coming into the garden. The word gets out quickly. Onward. And then my friend and one-time student at NYBG class, Julie Sakalariadis, took this picture from the 2nd floor of the stone mill looking down into a drift, clearly a drift of Phlox divaricata or woods phlox. And notice how it starts at a high density in the lower right and fades out as you go to the, starts out at a high density in the lower right and fades out as you go left. And similarly, the ragwort near the river is more dense and then trails off. And you can really use that effectively in design. I felt like I learned that from Joe Condis, who was John Bracken's student at Penn State. Onward. And here's another project which I have really enjoyed being associated with. This is the native flora garden at Brooklyn Botanic Garden. And in 2013, they decided they wanted to expand their native flora garden, which is a woodland now, the right-hand side of the slide. But they had this area, basically an acre, that was open lawn for the most part. And there we replaced the lawn with plantings of the New Jersey and pine barrens and Long Island pine barrens, as well as the prairies of the Hempstead Plain, a grassland on Long Island. There was once 60,000 acres of prairie on Long Island, New York. wow. And many of them are the same species that I knew in Wisconsin, and others were new to me. But anyway, my colleague at Columbia, Diana Drake, took this great picture a year after we planted the native flora garden extension. The next slide is a view of the boardwalk over the Pine Barrens bog and pond. And the next slide is one taken by none other than Nancy Ayton in about 2014 in the winter. And therein lies another lesson. Winter landscapes can be beautiful, and you can have winter color without evergreens. Here we do have evergreens because it's a pine barrens, and we put in the pitch pines. But the little blue stem with its copper color, and then the sweet everlasting silver gray, what a combination, and how beautiful it is. I like it as much as the summer landscape. Next slide. And then another illustration of what you can do with previous lawn. This is an unusual house in Wilton, Connecticut, the Roundhouse. After an eastern meadow had been planted. I won't go into boring detail here, but again, this was once lawn, just a couple of years before this, and the next slide is on that same side. Here's a view from under the house, under the circular house, looking out over it. And the neighbors here basically all have clipped lawns, clipped hedges, pour on the chemicals, pour on the water, and my wonderful client here, Rhea, doesn't do any of those. She did work hard on this, though, getting it established, and she did a lot of the weed removal herself early on when there were undesirable species that we didn't really want there. But again, when you can have all that life and all that movement and the butterflies and the bees, why would you want a lawn? Onward. Another detail of that, a little bit of luminosity there in the background. Next slide. And here's another area, a very rocky slope where we planted trembling aspen and sumac. We have senecio in the foreground, woods phlox and sedges higher up, onward. And then finally, since 2006, I've had a great ongoing consulting project at a big ranch in Montana. And here you see the view from the guest house out into the landscape with limber pines. Limber pines are the only pines that will withstand the 100+ mile-an-hour winds that blow through in the spring a lot of times. Okay, next slide. On this ranch, there were some pre-existing ponds that had disturbance with grading around them. So we restored Montana prairie to those slopes. Next slide. Here's a walk out to the council ring. Had to have a council ring, which you will see, I think, in the next picture. There it is, the council ring at the ranch in Montana. And if I can, I'm going to close, I hope, with a little thing I wrote, and it is it is in the book. But anyway, I spent many days there, but I spent one day in August of 2017, late August, going over the site and reflecting on the 10 years plus that I'd been working with the project. Anyway, I arrive at the council ring at near sunset, and I'll try not to get emotional. It's almost sunset time. I walk the winding pathway through the limber pines to the council ring. The pine shadows are lengthening as I sit on the rustic circular wall. A chipmunk pokes through a tiny opening between the rocks and pauses to look quizzically at me. What is he doing in my council ring? As I look westward, the sun is just above the horizon. The diminutive grasses, backlit with golden light, are luminous. They continue to bob in the light evening breeze. The air is taking on a chill, a hint of fall. As the sun sets, a sense of well-being settles over me. I feel infinite gratitude for the privilege of working with clients who love this place. and have made provisions for its protection and preservation, ensuring that the beauty of the wild will live on here in perpetuity. And that's it. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. I've talked a long time. I don't know if we have time for many questions.
Couple questions?
I'm from New York in the Hudson Valley, and a lot of our protected lands have real problems with invasives, and I'm wondering how you manage that in your design.
Protecting Hudson Valley, a lot of invasive problems. And how do you manage invasives in your designs?
Yeah, well, it's different with every site because there's a different site history and a different set of invaders, and it isn't easy. And one thing I have learned, for example, in Rhea's garden at the Roundhouse, is we're better off clipping weeds at the ground level rather than pulling them, because every time you pull a weed, you create a new disturbance, and there's a place for new, oftentimes undesirable seeds to germinate. So that's one thing. Another is doing mowing at selective times where you can really suppress certain species. If you have the luxury of burning, that can be effective. At Storm King Art Center, we've burned now for about 15 years during the period in the spring after cool season things have started growing, and many of the invasive species are cool season or woody species that we want to discourage. If you burn after the cool season, plants have started growing, which is anytime the temperature is above 32 degrees, but before the warm season plants start growing at 65 degrees, then you can suppress many of the cool season things without hurting, and in fact encouraging the warm season things, because the blackened soil warms up more rapidly and it's in favor of the native grasses and other warm season things. But it's not easy, I know. Others? Well, I look forward to meeting some of you and talking to you and
Let me do just a
signing a
little
few books.
wind up, Daryl. I'm just
If I can climb out.
quick change places. I put the microphone right up there, sorry. I just wanted to finish up by saying that Dan and I really enjoy being part of the Crossroads at Big Creek community. And I just want to reiterate what Laurel said, that annual membership really helps, $35 a year. I really encourage you to support all of the outdoor experiences, the Habitat Loop Trails, the Junior Nature Club, the Summer Adventurers, the ecological restoration work, and talks like the one tonight that Crossroads provides. And of course, if you're inclined to plant trees and remove weeds, clipping them, come on Saturdays at 9:30 for Habitat Healers. And in 2 weeks, 2 weeks from today on the 14th, Dan and I will be giving a talk here on remeandering, the ecological restoration work here at Crossroads. So please linger, enjoy the refreshments. I just want to tell you that you are not allowed to leave until all the food is eaten, so just so you know that. Daryl will be signing copies of his book, Beauty of the Wild, that Novel Bay Booksellers has for sale. Thank you so much for coming. Enjoy this beautiful evening, and once again, thanks to Daryl.